Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Appleseed Network, I would like to welcome you all to today's roundtable conversation, The Road to Integration, which will look at school segregation, frameworks to help us approach equity and integration, and the importance of student voices in the ongoing fight for real integration. My name is Sarah Pasilio, and I have the amazing job of working with so many incredible advocates, some of whom you'll hear from today, from the 18 legal justice centers across the US and Mexico that make up the Appleseed Network. This webinar is the first in a 4-part series on school segregation led by New York Appleseed and Texas Appleseed that will be held over the course of the year. So without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Naya Berg, the Executive Director of New York Appleseed, to introduce the project and get us started into the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited to be here to present The Road to Integration, School Segregation, and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Equity, as Sarah had just mentioned. This is the first in a 4-part webinar series, and particularly I'm extra excited today because this is the ongoing work of New York Appleseed. New York Appleseed, of which I am the executive director. We advocate for integrated schools and communities across New York City and state and have been doing so for well over a decade. But this is particularly special today because we are joined by not only the Appleseed Network, but also our colleagues over at Texas Appleseed for this collaborative project, which I'm going to sort of focus on in a little bit. Really quickly, I want to just give you a purview of what we're hoping to accomplish today. We have really exciting guest speakers, but first we also want to ground ourselves in some context. And that brings us over to the agenda for today. And so we will start with talking about why New York City and Texas are still so segregated, why school segregation persists. This will be an overarching big picture because, like I said, we only have an hour. That's probably about a 4-hour limited series that we could make on that topic specifically. But I want to make sure that we're highlighting and honoring our guest speakers because they have really formative information about the frameworks that can help us on the road to integration, on furthering equity, inclusivity, and integration in schools. And then we also will squeeze in some time at the end for sort of a question and answer, really thinking about what are our beginning, continuing steps, or also our collective next steps together, as this is also part of a collaborative project, as I said. So we have to thank the Spencer Foundation for bringing us together for really this collaborative project where we're focusing on a collaboration between highlighting our communities and community needs in Texas, really laying the groundwork for community-driven statewide effort to integrate schools and communities, really sort of in those beginning steps of what is how can we describe and quantify school segregation through new research? What is that going to look like? And Andrew from Texas Appleseed is going to elaborate a little bit on that a little bit after me. But also in New York, with this project, with this webinar series, we're also going to be working about increasing community awareness on so many of the substantive resources and tools that really right before the pandemic, there were a lot of substantive wins and even throughout. And some of that sort of got sucked into the time warp that was the pandemic. And so we're really going to be using this project to focus on getting the tools and resources back into the hands of communities, as well as really listening in on what those needs are once again, as well as supporting Texas Appleseed. Like I said, we've been doing this for some time over in New York, and we have a lot of lessons learned and challenges and successful wins and accomplishments, and we want to be able to share that knowledge and have a reciprocal pipeline of that information with Texas and New York that also can be an example for other places across the country that might be thinking about how they can further integration, but how they can also learn from others that might not be the obvious choice of where they might think there might be lessons and information to learn from. And that brings us on to the road of integration. And I We're starting today at the very beginning of our journey with sort of a brief overview of why we are so segregated, understanding the levers of segregation, but then really also honing in on these frameworks for equity of the hope, but also more than hope, but the real tangible pieces that can help us with furthering the goals of having a diverse school where all students of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and cultures are thriving and being supported. Well, we got to start with the why are we so segregated, right? And really start with that. And that goes to the legacy of redlining and historical residential segregation. And I want to start with this piece because I think this is what connects us the most. And it is something that not only is prevalent in New York, but also in Texas. The legacy of redlining and historical residential segregation is pervasive across the country. The federal policy that essentially color coded maps for where folks could live is a staple of that history. And in that previous picture, you'll see that on the left there was a map of the redlining in New York City, in which if you lived in a green area or a blue area, I guess it's a greenish blue. It was great, and you had a really great chance of getting a home loan. And if you lived in the red area, it was not so great. And in the green area, that is where white people lived, and in the red area, that is where Black and African American families lived, right? And then on the right, you see that that is actually a map from, I believe it was Koch and Fowler City Plan in Austin, Texas. That was in 1928 that actually preceded, was before the homeowners loanership corporation maps, in which they had actually they called it the Negro district. That was where they had placed African American families and limited the essential services and public schools that were available to them. And then after that, in the 1930s, then the redlining maps layered on top of that. And then we continue to see how this line of residential segregation continues both within the city as well as in other places in Texas, such as in Austin. And that sort of is that similar line that keeps us together. But again, on a high level, why is New York City so segregated? And it's not only the redlining, but it's also the cumulative impact of both driving and segregative forces that were really this vicious cycle in the mid 20th century that really solidified the segregation. So you not only had redlining, but you also had white flight, in which you had white middle class families that were able and also were living to go live the dream of the single family home, the picket yard fence. And then we're also able to do so because white families had access from the policies and practices that Black families did not, right? So you also had racial covenants and racial steering happening at the same time. Covenants that said that you could not lease, rent, buy, what have you, sell your home to someone who wasn't a member of the Caucasian race. And then you also at the same time had migration patterns happening, particularly in New York City, where you had about 6 million Black folk that were fleeing racial violence in the South. And then you also had, again, the driving force of exclusionary zoning. You had attendance boundaries being purposely drawn to exclude and isolate based on demographic information. And we saw this sort of perpetuate with residential segregation. And then as far as what that looks like today, you have the compounding effect of the historical residential segregation alongside unfettered school choice in New York City. So in New York City, we have screens, we have segregated gifted and talented programs, we have this very complex assortment of high school admissions policies that go to continuing the segregation that we saw in the past and continuing it today. Those two pictures that you see also there is one of a redlining map on the left, or my left, and then the dotted map is of student demographics today. And so you can see how much our history is still overlaying and very present. And with that, that sort of, again, is a very speedy way of going through why New York City is so segregated, but I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to talk about Texas.
Thank you so much, Naya. It's an honor to be with you. I'm Andrew Hairston from Texas Appleseed. I direct our Education Justice Project. I want to thank the Appleseed Network for putting this on, for New York Appleseed and its collaboration, and to my colleagues Gabriella McDonald and Maddie Sloan for their support in all of this. So I've been at Texas Appleseed since 2019, and we've been thinking about this issue, especially in a cross-programmatic way, across the Education Justice Project and our Fair Housing and Disaster Recovery Project. And the elements that I just explained very much so flow into Texas, into why Texas is so segregated. If you think about large cities like Dallas and Houston, certainly some of the same elements exist, like discriminatory and exclusionary zoning, the segregation of public and affordable housing, lending discrimination for access to mortgages, and government facilitated white flight, just to name a few. And if you think about some of the smaller communities across Texas and more rural communities, I was thinking about this earlier. My mother grew up in a small town in Louisiana called Tallulah that is very similar to communities across East Texas, where you might have Black districts within a city, uh, very much so facilitated by these physical barriers within the communities and within cities. And you can look at so many small villages and hamlets across Texas that will reinforce that example. And then not only is there the federal policy that Naya spoke about, but certainly the judicial branch through the Supreme Court has reinforced the segregation. We are commemorating the 50th anniversary of San Antonio versus Rodriguez this year, which was a case that really tied property taxes and property tax revenue to school financing. And so you can think about how these maps that show Black districts and how city planning very much so was focused on segregating communities based on race. If you don't have the property tax value that can support a neighborhood school, then you can very much so end up with an under-resourced community school program. And so that is very much so contextualizing how we've gotten to this place in 2023, where in large cities across Texas, and we thought about Travis County, where Austin is located, all the way to communities like Lubbock, Beaumont, Port Arthur, Bryan College Station, in various diverse communities in that way in terms of size and population, you will see segregation pop up in the ways that those cities have been administered over the past 50 to 70 years in particular. And as we continue to think about these issues, I'm very excited to hear from the young people from Integrate NYC today. But this is something that very much so plays into the academic experience of young people in real time because of under-resourced community schools in particular. Young people have very much so not had access to the full academic resources that should be made available to them, and certainly addressing this pernicious history of housing and school segregation will lift the tide for all folks, particularly young people, and give them the access to the safe and supportive and nurturing learning environments that they deserve. With that background on Texas in mind, I'll pass it back to Naya.
Thanks, Andrew. Again, very high level purview, but we believe that that context is important for being able to couch the really substantive work and efforts of the two guest speakers that, or the two groups, three guest speakers that we have today. And starting off, our first guest speaker, again, talking about frameworks that can help us really think through what are the processes, mechanisms, frameworks that can help us with resolving an issue that has been plaguing us for decades upon decades. And with that, we start off with Dr. Jennifer Jellison Holme. She is a professor of education policy and planning in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at UT Austin. Her research has focused on politics and implementation of education policy, with a particular focus on the relationship among school reform, equity, and diversity in schools. I myself have always been inspired by one of her papers and book as well that talks about regional equity frameworks. And so I'm really excited to have her start us off today. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Naya. As Naya said, my name's Jennifer Holme. I use she, her pronouns, and it's a true honor to be here and part of this conversation, this incredibly important conversation. And I just want to thank Naya and Andrew and New York and Texas Appleseed and their partners for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My talk today is going to be building on the context that Naya and Andrew had laid out. And it kind of provides a bit of a high-level 30,000-foot view of a framework that my co-author of a book that I wrote, and Kara Finnegan and I wrote. We think it's a promising framework, and I think it'll really complement the voices that you're going to hear after my presentation on sort of some of the community-based strategies as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Today's talk is really going to be based off the book that Naya had referenced that I wrote with my co-author, Kara. And so my talk is going to be divided into two parts. One is sort of thinking about understanding our approach really entails understanding how this approach is different than a lot of the traditional ed policy approaches currently to addressing educational inequality. So we're going to I'll briefly go through some of the problems with the current predominant approaches, and then lay out this regional framework, which we think offers a very promising, admittedly aspirational way of looking at these issues and addressing the underlying causes of inequality rather than the symptoms, which we argue many policies are only focused on the symptoms rather than the causes. So if we can go forward. We argue in our book and thinking about this framework that existing policy approaches tend to fail to address these underlying root causes of educational inequality. And one of the reasons for this is that they are sort of driven by flawed assumptions or theories about what the source of the problem is. And so oftentimes assumptions and theories that are driving education policies are incomplete or at worst misguided and can make the problem worse. I'm going to kind of go through a couple of common definitions or assumptions around the causes of educational inequality and kind of lay out our thinking around some of these ways of defining the problem and the solutions that follow. So one way of defining the problem, as we all know, is that educational inequality is the result of a lack of sort of standards and accountability, maybe a lack of focused effort or enough talent by educators in the system. So under this framing of educational inequality, the problem of educational inequality, the focus is really on change within the system and tinkering within the system. You can go forward. So the solution is to improve incentives or sanctions or change governance structures. And so there's sort of a menu here of things that we often try in the ed policy sphere to kind of deal with this problem of educational inequality, including a number of things like market competition or standards and accountability. You can go forward. But the research results are that the results of these are very mixed. It largely depends on implementation, can be very hard to scale up. And the biggest issue is that it leaves these underlying structural inequalities that Naya and Andrew had described completely unaddressed. So you leave these segregated communities and inequities around tax base, health, employment, and housing untapped. And this map on the right, I think, is a really powerful illustration of the limitations of some of these approaches. It's a map of Milwaukee's school district boundaries, and you can see the high level of concentration of poverty in the census tracts within those district boundaries. And the blue dots are schools that are identified by the state as failing. And so even under a system of standards and testing and accountability, where are all the quote unquote failing schools in this system or schools that are struggling as defined by testing and accountability, which are very limited measures in terms of understanding schools. But they're all concentrated, not coincidentally, within Milwaukee, which has a long history of structural racism, causing these problems. So another way we think of the problem of educational inequality is that there's a lack of investment in neighborhoods that have caused a decline in access or reduced access to resources, a lack of targeting of resources. And so a solution here is place-based strategies, which we do think are very promising, but they are not alone enough. And so we can go to the next slide. So we have a solution around improved health and social services, stabilizing, revitalizing neighborhoods. One famous example, of course, is the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. And the focus is saturating communities with resources and strategic investments. And while we think they're promising, these two have their limits. And so if you can go to the next slide, alone, they have their limits. So the results in the research is that there are some gains, but it's challenging to scale and then sustain financially. And again, it too does these community-based investment and community development strategies, while they're one important piece of the puzzle, it doesn't get at the underlying systems driving the inequality in the first place. And so as Patrick Sharkey has written in his book, Stuck in Place, policies that target resources towards specific places, if implemented, are unlikely to have broad impacts that will reduce racial inequality on their own. So they are one component, but they are not sufficient to address these problems. And we can go to the next slide. And then another piece of the way of defining the problem, which is something that is near and dear to this conversation, is thinking about educational inequality being a cause, school segregation as being a problem of educational inequality. And so the solution, of course, is school integration within or between districts. And we think, of course, this is a very promising approach and something that's really critically important. But we think it needs also to be one part of a broader strategy. So the research results, of course, are extremely positive on school and the benefits of school integration, especially over the long term on families and children's lives for their children and grandchildren, as Rucker Johnson's research has shown. But if we can go to the next slide. And what we write about in our book is we studied, our book is based on our study of interdistrict desegregation programs, which promote integration across school district boundary lines between cities and suburbs. And so we actually studied each of these programs in our research and wrote about them in our book. So we think that they are important models for hope within this space. But we did find they ran up against a lot of challenges. If we can go to the next slide. Our study showed that they had a lot of challenges because these were sort of programs operating kind of in isolation and sort of facing these forces on their own. So there's lots of tension around the purposes of this plan. And there was political tensions, oftentimes lack of supports for students of color in white settings. And these plans were very politically tenuous. As well. So while we think they are a great reason for optimism and deserve all of our support, they need more support. They need broader systems around them to support the causes and address the underlying causes of inequality. So we can keep going. So to sort of summing up this first part of my presentation, so the ways that we define the problem of educational inequality and so many prominent approaches do have promise, but they have some limits. So they're either limited in sustainability or fraught with tension politically or operating in isolation on their own without a lot of other political support. And in some cases, in the case I'd argue of standards and accountability and market-based reforms can make the problems worse. And our bigger argument is that it's really failing to address these underlying systems that drive inequality in the first place. So we really need to tackle those drivers of inequality that sustain inequity structurally that we need to get at. So we need to get at that big iceberg underneath the water here in this picture. And we need to see and recognize that. So I'll kind of go on to the next part of my talk, which is thinking about this alternative framework that we call a regional framework to address inequality. And I'll talk a little bit about how it relates to integration initiatives. So a deeper but overlooked cause, we argue, is this issue of fragmentation. We call it fragmentation and segregation within metropolitan areas. And fragmentation is the existence of numerous separate municipalities and school districts within a metropolitan area. And I'll show some examples in New York and in Texas shortly. But they're results of policy decisions that have happened over decades. The first is the policies that Naya and Andrew had described, federal government policies around redlining, subsidizing the movement of white families to suburbs, denial of those opportunities for people of color, and exclusion of them from those wealth building opportunities. And at the same time, these policies, of course, fueled disinvestment in urban cores. And then a second piece of this is that state laws then allowed, once white families were given money to move out of urban cores, the states then allowed them to wall themselves off into separate cities and school districts, creating their own municipalities and their own school systems. And so what you end up with is, this is a map on the right of the St. Louis metropolitan area, dozens and dozens of cities and school systems surrounding an urban core, which perpetuates the mere existence of all of these municipalities that are separate and distinct, are a ongoing source of segregation and resource inequality. And I'll talk about how that is in my next slide. So what happens is, when you have many school systems or many cities in a metropolitan area, it creates, and when they're segregated and economically unequal, it creates a competition between them for tax spaces and resources and businesses. And so what ends up happening is that in these competitions, affluent suburbs use the tools that are available to them, like land use and taxation policies, to exclude low-income families, zone out low-income housing, and zone in affluent families by setting minimum lot size requirements and minimum house size requirements. And the benefits of these tools is they're able to keep their cost burdens low, their tax base high, and their tax rates low. So they have low tax rates and abundant resources with which to serve their residents. But lower income communities that had been created due to the structural racism, they start with a low tax base, and then they have a hard time luring families and businesses to their community that have resources. So they oftentimes have to tax themselves at very high rates to yield very low revenue. And so it's hard to work with that math. As Myron Orfield says, it's hard to really lure people there, saying, come here, we'll tax you at a really high rate and you're going to get few services. And so as a result, these communities tend to have a disproportionate amount of low-income housing due to a lot of state policy that Andrew had referenced, many residents with needs and few tax resources with which to meet them. And so this ends up creating a cycle. If we can kind of go to the next slide, which is, and this is an example, sorry, of fragmentation. This is Rochester, New York. So you can see these numerous school district boundaries around this core city of Rochester. So the city and school district boundary lines are mostly the same. And there's numerous school districts within the Rochester metro area. And you can see where the poverty is concentrated in one in the city of Rochester. And then we'll go to the next slide. Looking at Texas, we have kind of an unusual situation where on the left, it shows the city limits of San Antonio. The city limits are actually very large and covers almost the entire metro area of San Antonio. So you can see that gray on the left. And then on the right, you can see that there's actually numerous school districts, though, carved out within the San Antonio metropolitan area. So that's an example of highly fragmented set of school districts, but the city itself is large. So it's slightly different and kind of unique. I'm happy to answer questions about that at some point. But if we can keep going here. So what we argue in the book is that this fragmentation and the competition between these different unequal communities just has a self-perpetuating cycle of segregation and inequality built in it that generates and perpetuates inequality. So if you have segregated communities with low tax bases, they have to impose high tax rates to provide services, driving other people to choose other places to live. Middle-class families and businesses tend to choose other communities with lower tax rates and better services. And the cycle continues almost without anyone needing to do anything. It's all the policies that weave together. So we argue that this is, if we can go to the next slide, that this is then, if we define the problem as this fragmentation and competition across regions, then you need a regional approach to address this problem. So we need to tackle these the segregation patterns and these competitive relationships. And we need, again, like I mentioned, this idea of a regional approach beyond one school district to cover multiple school districts and communities to address inequality. And so if we can go to the next slide. So the regional approaches, John Powell talks about this, how it shifts the framework for policymaking. So it's a way to reconceptualize metropolitan areas for the common good of all residents, affluent or not. Instead of calling upon each locality to take responsibility only for itself, regionalism recognizes the entire area as a system of interdependent parts. The whole will prosper only if all parts are able to function. So it's this idea of including everyone in the entire metropolitan area as part of one community and designing policies in that way. There are two examples. We talk about a few in our book, but in education, there's sort of one example that has existed. Regrettably, it has been chipped away over time politically in the state of Nebraska, but it sort of represented the one and only real example of this in education that was enacted. And so I'll kind of walk through that really quickly. So it was called the Learning Community of Douglas and Sarpy Counties, created in 2007 after years of conflict between the Omaha School District, the Central City District, and the suburbs around resources and segregation. The policy solution that came up there was some dispute around school district boundaries. The solution left boundaries intact, but created a regional solution to address inequalities across the metro area in both resources, tax base, and school segregation. And so the unit that was created, again, was called the Learning Community. It's since been modified, and regrettably, a lot of the more promising elements have been chipped away due to political forces. But I think we think it represents sort of a really promising vision around what could happen in regional solutions in education and to address segregation. And there's 4 components to this. One is, these are components that we argue are needed in a regional framework. The first is regional governance. And so what they had is a 21-member governing board called the Learning Community Coordinating Council that was elected in a general election. Like when you go to a general election, you elect members to this council from across the entire metropolitan area. And the 11 superintendents did play an advisory role. If we can keep going. And so this is where it just shows all the different school districts in different colors, and then the election districts for the coordinating council. And we'll keep going. Component 2, we argue that's important for a regional framework, is tax-based sharing across communities. And so it did have a tax-based sharing plan to pool and then distribute school finance resources back to communities based on need. So high wealth and low wealth tax resources were pooled and then redistributed. And then there was an extra levy across the whole region to fund magnet schools and also investments in elementary learning centers. So it really equalized resources, and in theory would reduce the competitive competition between localities. So there's some theory around how it can create more equity as well. It can interrupt the processes driving inequality. The third component is sort of related to those in-place investments I talked about earlier. So they had funneled resources into communities that had high poverty and were historically marginalized, and created these elementary learning centers. So they levied a tax across all 11 districts and then funneled money into these particular highest poverty communities in the Omaha metro area. So there were sort of these in-place investments that we think are important. And then lastly, component 4 was thinking about integration across school district boundary lines. And so they created an integration program. This was by socioeconomic status, but it was a way of trying to ensure that students had access across school districts in the metro area. And then they also had interdistrict magnet schools that were an option to be created as well. So we think that these solutions are promising in that they attack systems of competition, they reduce barriers resulting from school district boundaries for students, they target investments, and then they require attentiveness to these regional inequities through governance and resources. And so in summary, this is sort of a recap of what we argue for in a regional equity framework. There's both with schools and with broader communities. There's a need for tax-based sharing, mobility policies, both in schools and housing, allowing children and their families to move freely across for the purposes of integration across boundary lines. in-place investment, so for both educational programs and community development, and then governance, regional governance. So this idea that all voices across a region are represented, and also critically important is coordination across sectors, so that it shouldn't be an education initiative alone or a housing initiative alone or transit. All of those sectors ideally need to be brought into the conversation. So just thinking, my last slide here is thinking about what you can do in your space, bringing stakeholders to a common table, inviting folks from different parts of a metropolitan area together, and different stakeholders to come and start discussing the problems. Thinking about reframing the problem as a regional problem rather than an urban problem or an issue that's only limited in scope to one particular geographic area. I think helping reframe the problem as a regional equity issue, and that regional inequality is a driver of all these problems is really important. Another important strategy, that's something that we borrowed from Myron Orfield, is thinking about this coalition amongst municipalities with common interests. So oftentimes we have inner ring suburbs and urban cores that might have really common interests aligned and can build coalitions in ways that they may not otherwise notice or see. And that can be a potential for political mobilization. And then advocating for cross-sector conversations, bringing people, instead of we tend to stay in our lane in education or housing, and that's not true of the work that Appleseed does. Appleseed's a really good example of bringing people across sectors together, but we argue for that as well. And the next slide. And that's all. I think that's it for me, but thank you so much for letting me be a part of this conversation and presenting our framework.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Incredibly informative. And I can't help but think about how important this regional equity framework that you just discussed is, particularly when we have new federal funding opportunity right now for fostering diverse schools, and how it could definitely apply. But more on that later, maybe. I want to switch it over to introduce our next guest speakers, student leaders from IntegrateNYC, Kayshawn and Melanie. IntegrateNYC is a youth-led organization that stands for equity and justice in schools. They develop youth leaders and repair the harms of segregation and work to build authentic, real integration and equity. So without further ado, I am going to pass it over to them. Before I do, for folks that want to engage in the comments while they're introducing themselves, one question that we want to pose first is, what comes to mind when you define integration? How do you define integration? And with that, I'll pass it to Kayshawn and Melanie.
Thank you so much. So I'm Melanie Pranashide, and I am a youth program director at IntegrateNYC. And this is my colleague, my friend.
Hi, my name is Kayshawn Keller. I am a youth director at IntegrateNYC, and pronouns he, they.
So, like Naya mentioned, IntegrateNYC really focuses on developing youth leaders in repairing the harms of segregation, and to truly make sure that they are equipped with the tools to bring equity in the education system. So IntegrateNYC does this through campaigns. We had After the Test, Segregation is Killing Us, Retire Segregation, and right now we're focusing on building out our campaign, My School, My Vote, which has to do a lot with community control, connecting with the previous guest speaker. And through all these campaigns, Integrate really hopes to, once again, just make sure that the education system is truly equitable for students of all races, genders, ethnicities, etc. And to do this, IntegrateNYC has a framework, which we call the 5 R's. And within that framework, we have race and enrollment, which focuses on integrating our schools racially and ethnically, so prioritizing diversity. We see this we try to implement this through changing admission systems and processes and things like that, which connects to our next R.
Which is resources. This is where we talk about making sure that there is books and people that we can go to that give us the tools to and opportunities to have different, diverse, and opportunities to even talk about certain things that are not talked about in our system. So, which leads us to
relationships, which is really making sure that students feel safe and supported in their community. So making sure that there's good teachers, enough guidance counselors, and making sure that students don't feel penalized or like criminals within their school, seeing as they're going there almost 5 days out of the week, and which connects to our next R.
which following up with relationships is restorative justice. This is one of our key R's. For example, things like a scenario of getting in trouble because there was a fight that occurred, instead of automatically getting into a really strategic and harsh form of punishment or resolution, we choose to have things like peer mediating, where we get to talk about the problem at hand and discuss the situation so that we can disperse it and let it digress within each other, besides, so that we don't continue the school to prison pipeline.
And with that, we have representation. So making sure that students actually feel seen through their school faculty, and making sure that they're learning about, making sure that they have opportunities to learn about their culture and not just have simply one version of history, and making sure that students, feel like they aren't alone at their schools. Representation is really key to that. Um, and so with that, I there's with that that concludes our 5 R's. So basically with this framework, there's a lot of interconnect like there's a lot of connections within them, and that's purposefully made because one R can exist without the other, and these R's really work best when they're all happening, when they're all being implemented. And so to kind of have some um, interactiveness, we have a little. We're gonna present stories, and you guys are gonna determine which R does the story represent. These stories come from our website, from our listening tour. So they're real stories from students that are actually going through the New York City public school education system. Our first story talks about invasion of privacy, and basically a student was in AP US history and learning about US imperialism. Since debates are popular mediums in history classes to gauge student critical skills and widening perspectives, students were asked to participate in a debate about this unit's topic. Students discuss the pros and cons of imperialism, specifically in the context of the Spanish American War, a topic that can be traumatic to students and their families. There are no pros to imperialism, and the reasoning used to justify imperialism is racist, xenophobic, and ableist. There is nothing to critically gauge about U.S. imperialism. It just was/is. Just was/is power mongering. Just was/is classist. Just was/is racist. Being a critical thinker/historian is important, but debating an evidently traumatic and horrific practice is not. So if you guys want to type in the chat what R you believe this is connected to, there can be multiple answers because, like we said, all the R's are very connected. So I'm seeing that there's relationships and representation being typed in the chat a lot. Yeah. I think that, again, that this is with stories and hearing them, a lot of ours kind of show up in them. So I definitely see how this connects to relationships with fellow students and also with their teachers, and feeling comfortable to express their opinions about whether or not they think the lesson is crucial or not. I also see representation in making sure that the representation isn't always depressing or traumatic, but also making sure that there's moments of celebration of people's cultures. Definitely see that. Um, our next story talks about a student um, who at their school told them about their freshman global class. She mentioned how her class spent 2 months on the unit about Martin Luther King and the about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, which was boring and didn't reflect her identity as a Black female student. When her class entered the Africa unit, she said the teachers prefaced with a small class discussion about students' prior knowledge of Africa, and they made sure to address the issue, which is NYC's very Eurocentric curriculum, where students don't learn about Africa unless it is connected to slavery in some way. That being said, her teacher only spent a week that week on the early Africa unit and assigned a homework to read 14 textbook pages about Africa. They did not prioritize class time like they did for the Protestant Reformation unit. She was upset that the teachers led with an empathetic and more progressive approach, but continued to quickly skim throughout the. I'll give you guys a moment to type in the chat on which R you believe this is mainly connected to.
I'm seeing possibly resources, representation being brought up. Also seeing relationships as well. Definitely, definitely. Given that they don't have any sense of a core relationship with their teacher, and that the teacher basically didn't really care and just assigned them the homework for the Africa unit about slavery, which can be insensitive at times and not said in a overall unbiased sense. It could be very Eurocentric. Definitely representation and relationships, as well as resources, given the fact that they couldn't even expand on the topic at hand and had to give out textbook pages about it. Definitely. On to the last story. where this student who stated, another who feels though their needs are being met and feel supported in their school. They mentioned how they feel as though the teachers enjoy their job and the opportunities to become close to their teachers. They also mentioned how they feel as though the curriculum is diverse and good and how they enjoy learning. They mentioned that the environment is very friendly and they feel though no one gets excluded. Now, I know previously we said we've presented stories that were, I would say, more on the negative end, but in this one, we have shed light on the positives of the 5 Rs being represented. So I'll give you time to let us get insight on what you guys think 5 Rs are being shown here. We got relationships, which is definitely there, definitely there. Given that the student had stated that the teachers enjoy their jobs and needs are being met, resources as well. Yes, again, we can obviously see that the teachers impact on the students, and given that they love their job and they know what they're doing, they can provide more resources and making sure that it's diverse, etc. So yeah. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Those are the stories. Those are only three of the stories that we have taken note of throughout the listening tour from last year. You can find these again on our website at IntegrateNYC.org/stories. And with that, we come to the end of our presentation, but truly the 5 R framework is a great way to implement and think about how we can implement integration at our schools. And like you guys taking note of in the stories, 1R has, it can't simply be 1R that's implemented, it has to be all of them.
Awesome. Thank you guys both so much. And I know you also have a call to action,
Yes.
which would you like me to? I can ask the question. This came from Kayshawn. Actually, oh, it's right up there. Would you like to go ahead? There we go.
Of course. So, given our presentation and given that we're talking about integration as a way to stop the segregation in these schools, I want to have a little connection with both school and work, and or other places that you guys have connection with. And the question I proposed was, how have your opinions, about integration changed/evolved from when you were a youth to now? To answer these questions, we would like you guys to go onto Twitter and hashtag Road to Integration and also hashtag IntegrateNYC, well, INYC, 5 Rs. And just state your opinion on this question. I know that given that there's different time periods and different generational things, especially when it comes from me and Mel's standpoint as youth now, is very different from before. And integration is something that is widely experienced, whether in schools or outside of that area. So yeah, I would love to hear your opinions, and yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you both to Jennifer as well as Melanie and Kayshawn. I will say also, if folks are not engaged on Twitter, feel free to drop your answer in the chat as well. And this also brings us to, I know we don't have a lot of time, but with the time we do have, questions for our panelists or anything that we also presented on today. I'll be looking in the comment section for questions, but I think I do want to pose the question back to both Kayshawn and Melanie first, and also Jennifer, the one that we just posed to our audience, which is how, it might not necessarily be, because you're also still students, but how have your opinions of integration sort of changed and evolved over time, particularly with the frameworks that both of y'all have sort of built and continue to sort of promote to other communities?
I would say for me, growing up with the current system in the beginning, since I was getting good grades and receiving praise from teachers and such, I thought that there wasn't anything wrong with the system, and for me, I viewed it as normal. So I didn't see the need to question it as much. As I entered a predominantly white middle school, again, even though I felt moments of exclusion and I saw the disparities and differences between my mainly Latino elementary school or other middle schools, I still didn't quite understand why that was happening. But it wasn't until I got involved in advocacy throughout my student council did I start to realize the harmful effects of it and the history behind it. So that made me venture into different organizations and different nonprofits, and I got to understand what true integration looks like and how what we have isn't that. And that kind of also inspired me to join Integrate.
Pertaining the question, similar to Mel, growing up in the area that I live in, my elementary school was, I would say, diverse to an extent until I went to middle school. That's where a lot of things shifted for me. I realized the different dynamics and the majority, like predominantly white race that was in my school, and how much of an impact that has on the other POC that are involved, as well as going into high school where it was the total opposite, where I felt like I was with people that were similar to me and we could relate, given that there was more POC than it being predominantly white. So I also would like to note that we brought up the third story because my opinions on integration initially, I felt that it would need to be something that all schools need to change or put emphasis on, given that it was more of like, if something's bad, then you need to integrate it. But also, we would like to highlight the positive integration that we have in schools now. For example, my school, we definitely have a very diverse group of people, and all races are talked about, and also there are few represented and stuff like that. So that's my thoughts on integration. So, yeah.
Thanks. One of the questions, oh, it's perfect. It's right up. This one's also a question from Kim that says that I believe youth advocacy is, if not the key, one of the keys to winning this fight. How would the students suggest, so how would y'all suggest spreading the type of advocacy that you're doing to other communities?
Well, I would say when it comes to suggesting it to other communities, I feel like there is a middle ground here when it comes to the advocacy that we are doing. And I feel like we've all, at some point in time, experienced some type of either segregation or injustice when it comes to the school system, and it comes to mayor control as well. So I feel like allowing the space to show the diverse areas and individuality when it comes to all of us and coming together to talk about the issues at hand would be definitely a great way to talk about the advocacy and connect it to other communities. I also, similar to what Mel said, I feel like we initially don't know about these things until they're brought up and talked about and brought to light. So I feel like also giving the chance to bring it to people's attention and educate them will be definitely a way of bringing it to other communities and educating and advocating for it.
I definitely agree. I think also it's important to note that me being here in some way is a connection to privilege I have because I don't have to take care of any little siblings. My parents are able to support me in going to certain events and things like that. And also because I had more resources or chances to join different programs to learn about this. So I definitely think that this is kind of connection and also question of resources that are available for youth. If they aren't offered it, many don't have, again, the resource to look for different opportunities. And so once that door kind of becomes open, it leads a path to more things. But unfortunately, many don't even have that initial door opening.
Thanks. And I know we're close to time. However, I do want to pass it over to Jennifer for the question that came through, which was, how do you factor in the Supreme Court's history of deference to school district borders, San Antonio v. Rodriguez, Milliken v. Bradley, when you're thinking about regional approaches? And I think this is, I will tack on really quickly. I think this is particularly important of a question to think about in the context of, again, what I brought up before, which is that there's actually a funding opportunity right now from the U.S. Department of Education on fostering diverse schools. So as school districts are also thinking of how they might want to apply or think about that, I want to pose that question to you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really great and important question. And I think the promise of regional approaches is that they really work within this context where boundary lines are basically very difficult to challenge in the current legal climate. So you're challenging school district boundary lines are very difficult. The only time that boundary lines are now challenged is when a state might dissolve a school district for low performance, and that often happens to historically marginalized inner ring suburbs. So that's a conversation for another time, where those districts tend to be dissolved by states. But beyond that, these boundaries are pretty much very difficult to challenge. And so regional approaches then provide a framework for working across those existing boundaries across a metro area those boundaries can be intact. The communities and the history of those communities, there's no need to dissolve boundaries in that way. And so the benefit of that oftentimes is that communities, historically marginalized communities and communities of color, they also don't have to sacrifice their boundaries in those spaces. But regional approaches then can be a way for people to work across those boundary lines and coordinate. And so, as Naya had mentioned, in this current funding opportunity, it encourages school districts to partner with other school districts for the purposes of integration. And so it really fosters kind of regional thinking that I would encourage folks to think beyond just a partner or pair and think about multiple school districts, consortia, if at all possible.
Awesome, thanks. And I think we are sort of at time, and I don't see any other questions, but I first want to thank our guest speakers. Thank you for your time, for your energy, for welcoming us all into this space and your knowledge. I want to thank Texas Appleseed, and also there's a man behind the curtain. His name is Quentin. He is making sure everything tech is running smoothly. So I want to also thank him. For those who want to engage with us more, you can find us on Twitter. You can find us on our websites that folks can drop into the chat. Please reach out to us with questions. And I think, even though I don't want to put words into the mouth of our panelists, that they also reach out with any questions that you might have on any of their work. I think it was the perfect question to end on, because she discussed this cross collaboration, and that's literally what our project is called, the Cross Collaborative Project between New York and Texas. And so we are answering that question as we speak with this project, and thinking about what we can do and lessons learned to start on furthering this road to integration. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.